Summer 2025. On the slopes of Mount Rinjani, Indonesia's second highest volcano, one of the largest rescue missions in the nation's history unfolds. A Brazilian traveler, 26-year-old Juliana Morins, slips and plunges nearly 2,000 feet into a place where every passing minute could be her last. Standard rescue methods fail, while news outlets across the globe broadcast the drama live. Rescuers are forced to invent a new method of descent, one that will be remembered in history. But the true tragedy will not take place on the mountainside. It will come after 4 days of relentless struggle. That same June, life on Lombok was calm. Towering over the island stood Rinjani, a 12,000-foot giant that drew hundreds of hikers every day. On June 20th, at the base camp, one figure stood out, a young woman in a red jacket. She laughed, took photos, and radiated energy. This was Juliana, and soon, the entire world would know her name. Back in Brazil, she was known as the girl of the road. By day she worked in public relations. By night she lived for dance. Salsa and bachata were her second language. She was always restless, but in a good way, her sister recalled. That spirit drove Juliana to dream not of a car or an apartment, but of a journey with a precise destination, Southeast Asia. In February 2025, she left Rio with a backpack and a plan. Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, each country opened a new world to her. Her Instagram became a window into adventure. By June, she had reached Indonesia, surrounded by volcanoes and beaches. For months of travel had made her resilient. Years of dancing had made her strong. She was in the best shape of her life. And that was when she chose Lombok. Less touristy than Bali, but just as beautiful. At its heart stood Mount Rinjani. The climb was tough, but achievable. The tour company offered the standard route: 1 day to reach camp, 1 night in tents, and a dawn push to the summit. The group included 6 foreign travelers and an experienced guide, Ali Mustafa, a man who had spent decades walking this trail and knew it by heart. On June 20th, nature offered perfect conditions: the height of the dry season, mild temperatures, and a forecast without a single cloud. At Simbalan Camp, Juliana stood out instantly with her bright personality. She laughed sincerely, filmed everything, from her packed backpack to the sweeping volcanic slopes, and kept joking with the guide. The trek began through dense tropical jungle. Around them, lush greenery, the songs of birds, and monkeys leaping through the trees. It was the perfect image of Indonesia. The hikers moved slowly, stopping often to rest and take photos. By evening, they reached the high camp and pitched their tents on a flat plateau with a breathtaking view of the starry sky. Dinner was cooked on small gas stoves, washed down with hot tea, as they shared their plans for the morning. Juliana felt great, showing no signs of exhaustion. She dreamed of the sunrise to come, to see the sun rise over the crater and capture the most treasured photos of her life. The mood in the group was light. Everyone went to sleep with excitement. Nothing seemed like it could go wrong. At 2 a.m. on June 21st, alarms rang. As always, the final ascent began in darkness. The goal, to reach the summit by sunrise, witnessed the first rays of light and descend before the heat of day. The temperature had dropped to 43 degrees, and the night fog made the air feel icy. The hikers pulled on warm jackets, checked their headlamps, and sipped hot coffee from thermoses. Ahead lay the hardest part: a climb over loose volcanic gravel, where every step forward slid halfway back, forcing them to battle the mountain itself. The narrow trail wound along the rim of the crater. To the right, an unforgiving slope. To the left, a black abyss. Fog concealed the danger, leaving visibility at only a few yards. The group moved in a tight line, following the glow of the guide's headlamp. Juliana walked last, as newcomers usually did. The first 2 hours were tough, but nothing out of the ordinary. Breathing was hard. At 3,000 meters, the air held a third less oxygen. Still, they kept the pace. Around 6:30 a.m., with only a short distance left to the summit, Juliana began to fall behind. At first the gap was small. Then it grew. She stopped more often, gasping for breath. It looked like the classic signs of altitude sickness, or simply extreme exhaustion. Ali Mustafa walked back to her, advised a short rest, then told her to catch up with the others. But when he returned to that spot, Juliana was gone. The path was empty. At first he thought she had taken another stretch of trail and moved ahead of the group. Then he heard it, the faint echo of a scream from below. He looked down into the void. Far in the crater's depths, a dim light flickered, and with it, a faint voice crying for help. Juliana had fallen. No one could say for certain what happened in that moment. She had been alone, surrounded by the dense pre-dawn fog. Yet the scene told its own story, a narrow trail hugging the cliffside, and soil slick with dew and mist, slippery as ice. Only Juliana herself could have said what happened in those fatal seconds. Perhaps altitude sickness made her dizzy. Perhaps her boot slipped on the wet rock. Or maybe she had simply tried to take one quicker step to close the gap with the group. But at such an altitude, when you can see only a few yards ahead and the ground is slick, any careless move can turn deadly. The slopes of the crater tilted at nearly 60 degrees. The fall was not straight down, but became a wild slide through loose rock and sharp outcroppings. It was a 1,000-foot plunge across jagged rubble, scree, and dangerous ledges. By some miracle, Juliana survived. A narrow stone ledge stopped her fall, and there, she found the strength to cry out. Her voice, weak but clear, echoed across the crater. It was the same voice her guide heard when he returned to check on her. Hearing the shouts and faint replies, the other hikers rushed over. One of them, a Spaniard, pulled out his drone and made a decision that would soon define the course of the entire rescue. The quadcopter lifted into the sky, then dipped carefully into the crater, guided only by the faint sounds from below. The images it sent back shocked everyone, blending hope with horror. Nearly 300 meters down, on a tiny ledge of gray rock, lay a figure in a red jacket. Juliana was still moving, raising her hand, trying to turn her head, shifting her position. She was alive, but she could not climb out on her own. Within minutes, the scale of the challenge became clear. More than 300 meters straight down, a 60-degree slope, loose volcanic soil that crumbled at the slightest touch, dense fog blocking visibility, and a young woman losing strength from cold and injury. Mustafa immediately radioed base camp, relaying the exact coordinates and a full description of the accident. By 7 a.m., the first reports had already reached Basarnas, the Indonesian National Search and Rescue Agency, less than 30 minutes after the fall. But it was obvious. This was not a case that could be solved with standard procedures. The tourists watched helplessly, staring at the drone's live feed, knowing there was nothing they could do. Only around 10 a.m. did the first rescue team arrive. For Basarnas climbers with mountaineering gear, 2 local rangers, and a doctor. Under normal conditions, ropes of 50 to 100 meters, anchors, and basic protection would have been enough for this altitude. Leadership fell to Muhammad Shafi, a seasoned rescuer with 15 years of experience in the mountains of eastern Indonesia. At 43, he had endured dozens of difficult missions. Yet even he admitted, after looking into the abyss, he had never seen anything like this. A 1,000-foot descent required at least 4 ropes joined together, dozens of anchor points, and rock-solid ground. And Rinjani's slopes were anything but stable. 22-year-old rescuer Ahmad Rizki volunteered to attempt the most dangerous sections. His knowledge of volcanic terrain was invaluable. The first attempt began at 11 a.m. Rizki and his partner tied their ropes to 100 meters and started down, setting intermediate anchors every 15 meters. But nearly half the anchors failed under their weight, tearing loose from the soil. The ground wouldn't hold the metal, and any sudden movement triggered small rock slides. At about 70 meters, they had to stop. Beyond that, the slope grew steeper, the rock more fragile. Rizki called into the void and heard a reply. Juliana's voice floated back, faint and weaker than in the morning, but she was still conscious. More than 200 meters of treacherous terrain still separated them from her ledge. By noon, conditions deteriorated sharply. Fog thickened, cutting visibility to barely 10 meters. Drones could no longer operate. Winds picked up to 40 kilometers per hour, threatening to dislodge rocks and knock climbers off balance. At 3 p.m., the rescuers tried another route, but it proved even more dangerous. The last time Juliana's voice was heard was around 6 in the evening. After that, only silence. By nightfall, everyone understood conventional methods would not work. To reach her, they would need something new, something untested. On June 22nd, The Cymbeline base camp was transformed into a full command center, larger than anything the mountain had ever seen. Rescue Chief Muhammad Shafi studied maps of the crater and knew one thing for certain. Standard manuals were useless. What was needed was an engineering revolution. From all across eastern Indonesia, reinforcements poured in. Specialized climbing teams, volcanologists, drones with thermal cameras, even military equipment. Local rangers provided maps marked with details of the terrain. Shafi devised a new strategy. Every 50 meters, an intermediate station, complete with gear stockpiles and a small platform for rest. Instead of traditional pitons, rescuers drove special bolts into the rock, designed to withstand enormous loads. Ahmad Rizki, after studying the plan, volunteered to take on the riskiest sections. For him, it was personal. At 15, he had lost his older brother in a landslide on Flores when help arrived too late. That day he made a vow. In the mountains, no one is left behind. Now had come the moment to prove it. By noon, the new system was ready. Each stage of descent took about 40 minutes. Rizki calculated every move and coordinated the team step by step. A single dislodged rock could drag a rescuer down along with the rope. At 3,000 meters, the wind swung them like pendulums, but Rizki pressed on, cutting a path for the others to follow. The drones never stopped flying. Thermal cameras showed one thing. Juliana was still alive. The signals were faint, but steady. That knowledge created urgency and justified the extreme risk. That same day, as rescuers built their descent system on the slope, a storm of information erupted in Brazil. Juliana's sister, Mariana, launched an Instagram account to share updates on the rescue. Within 48 hours, the page grew from 0 to 1.5 million followers. The hashtag #SalveJuliana spread worldwide, translated into dozens of languages. Every post from the base camp drew hundreds of thousands of views. Brazilian television switched to 24-hour live coverage, while international reporters flocked to Lombok. On June 23, Brazil's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, personally called the embassy in Jakarta, demanding hourly updates on the operation. A group of lawmakers submitted an official request to the foreign ministry, urging pressure on Indonesia. And star footballer Alexander Pato announced he was ready to pay all expenses. Indonesian authorities came under immense pressure. Additional resources poured in from every direction. Military helicopters delivered supplies, doctors and specialists arrived from other regions, and the Minister of Forestry briefed the president daily on the rescue. International attention quickly became not just support, but a burden. Every move the rescuers made was filmed by media drones. Any minor setback was dissected live on television. Crews worked 20-hour days, exhaustion mounted, and the chances of fatal mistakes grew. The operation had turned into a global spectacle, where the fate of one woman became a drama for millions. Then, on June 23rd, at around 2 p.m., disaster struck. Drones recorded part of the unstable crater wall collapsing, and Juliana sliding even farther down. She now lay 1,600 feet below the rim. Another 200-meter plunge through loose scree and cliffs had nearly erased her chances of survival. For the rescuers, it meant only one thing. They would have to rebuild the entire descent system from scratch, recalculating for the new depth. Shafi and Rizki knew the odds were almost gone, but duty left no room for surrender. That evening marked a turning point. They managed to set up a system capable of lowering rescuers 1,150 feet, an impressive technical feat, but another 500 feet of the most treacherous terrain still remained. For the last 4 hours, drones had detected no movement from below. Inside the command post, fierce arguments erupted. Younger rescuers demanded to keep going, no matter the cost. Veterans, relying on experience, knew the descent would be suicide. Shafi stood in the middle of the storm. On one side, global pressure and millions of eyes watching. On the other, the lives of his men. Ahmad Rizki once again volunteered for the final descent. But by 11:30 that night, it was clear to everyone. Even if they reached Juliana, the chances she was still alive were almost zero. No one dared say it aloud, but all understood the truth. Soon, on a closed communication channel, the words of the medical consultant came through. The verdict was absolute. A person with injuries from a fall of more than 300 meters, without medical treatment, cannot survive longer than 72 hours at temperatures around 6 degrees Celsius. 65 hours had already passed. Shafi made the hardest decision of his career. Officially, the mission remained a rescue. In reality, it had shifted into a recovery operation. The family was never told. Global pressure was too great, and too many cameras watched every move. The new objective demanded a different mindset. Now these men risked their lives not to save, but to return a daughter so she could be laid to rest. For professional rescuers, it was no less meaningful. The code, "No one is left behind in the mountains," applies even when life is already gone. By the morning of June 24th, the political consequences were clear. President Lula signed a decree lifting the ban on government funding for repatriating bodies from abroad. Indonesian authorities closed all routes on Rinjani, an unprecedented step that disrupted thousands of tourists. For the rescuers, the change in mission brought a grim sort of relief. They were no longer racing against relentless time, but executing a technical task, retrieving a body from 1,600 feet below. The risk remained deadly, but psychologically it was easier to accept. Ahmad Rizki prepared for the final descent as if it were the most important moment of his life. His goal was no longer to save, but to preserve dignity, to bring back the body of a young woman who had come seeking the world's beauty and return her home. The morning of June 24th began on Rinjani in the same bleak silence. The crater walls were shrouded in fog. The wind whistled sharply through the rocks. The temperature clung to 6 degrees Celsius. Nature remained indifferent to human grief. At 5:30, drones lifted once again into the air. Their thermal cameras scanned the familiar ledge 600 feet below. They showed only a still figure in a red jacket. No heat, no movement. At 6 o'clock, Rizki began the final descent. In 4 days, his team had built a technical system of dozens of anchors, a network that allowed them to reach depths once thought impossible. The bolts had been tested repeatedly. The ropes were rated to hold the weight of a vehicle. The safety systems were triple reinforced. The last stretch proved the most dangerous. The slope turned nearly vertical, rocks breaking loose at the lightest touch. Every move triggered another cascade of stone. Fist-sized rocks whistled past him, smashing against ledges below. At 8:15, Rizki hung on the rope just 3 meters from Juliana. She lay motionless, as if asleep. But the position of her body made it clear. Death had been instantaneous. Over the radio, he confirmed, no signs of life. For several seconds, the channel fell into absolute silence. Everyone had known this message would come. Yet when it did, the pain was unbearable. Mohammed Shafi announced that the rescue phase of the mission was over. At 8:25 a.m., the evacuation began. The task was no less difficult than the descent itself. Only at 2:30 p.m. did they manage to lift the body to the crater's rim. The rescuers met the moment in silence. No celebration, only respect for the young woman who sought beauty and lost her life in pursuit of it. Because of heavy fog and strong winds, a helicopter extraction was impossible. Instead, rescuers carried the stretcher on their shoulders, beginning an exhausting 8-hour descent along narrow mountain paths. At 10:40 p.m. on June 24th, they reached the Sembilan base camp. The physical part of the mission was complete, but the true consequences were only beginning. The body was taken to the police hospital in Mataram for examination, then prepared for repatriation. On June 27th, pathologists at Bali Mandara confirmed what seasoned rescuers had sensed from the start. Juliana had died within the first 30 minutes of her fall on June 21st. The cause was severe trauma and internal bleeding. Neither hypothermia nor dehydration played a role. Death came quickly. Her family, however, raised doubts. Some suspected Indonesian authorities had concealed the true time of death to justify delays in the rescue. Others believed the autopsy was mishandled or even falsified. They demanded a second autopsy in Brazil. But by then, Juliana's body had already been repatriated and laid to rest. On July 1st, East Lombok police questioned Ali Mustafa and 3 other witnesses. The guide insisted he had stepped away for only 3 minutes, and when he returned, Juliana was gone. The family told a different story. In their view, she had been left alone for more than an hour, an act of negligence. Her father, Manuel Morins, told Brazilian media, "If the guide had stayed with my daughter and done his job, she would still be alive." The contradiction between drone footage and the autopsy results fueled a wave of suspicion. Some experts suggested the recorded movements could have been caused by wind shaking her clothing or by errors in the thermal camera. But her family was convinced either the drone images or the medical report had been falsified. In Brazil, the case quickly rose to the political level. Lawmakers demanded an international investigation, while the Federal Public Defender's Office even considered filing a complaint with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. For the family, it was a devastating blow. For 4 days, they had lived on hope, watched by millions on social media, while global news channels broadcast the operation live. Yet in reality, their daughter had already been gone. The official investigation continues, but no charges have ever been filed. Indonesian authorities maintain they acted at the limits of human possibility under extreme conditions. The discrepancies in the evidence remain unresolved. For all who took part, the tragic irony was undeniable. For days of near-perfect execution had been doomed from the start. Yet the Rinjani rescue entered history as an example of extraordinary technical skill. The staged descent system designed by Shafi's team, anchored with intermediate stations, became a new benchmark for operations on volcanic terrain. Ahmad Rizki received the nation's highest award for bravery. In one interview, he said, "We knew we were too late. But our duty is to never leave anyone in the mountains." Juliana had to return home with dignity. The consequences of the tragedy were felt in both countries. President Lula not only lifted restrictions on funding for repatriations, but also ordered the foreign ministry to create new protocols for supporting Brazilians abroad. In Indonesia, rescue equipment was modernized, and the routes on Rinjani were temporarily closed to review safety systems. On July 4, 2025, Juliana Morins was laid to rest in her hometown of Niterói. Thousands attended the ceremony. President Lula personally offered his condolences to the family, and the city's mayor declared a day of mourning. A young woman who had traveled to the other side of the world in search of beauty, in death united 2 continents, and forever changed the rules of safety. Yet one mystery remains unsolved. What truly happened in those few minutes when Juliana was left alone with the fog?